Yeah, first I have to apologize because as I also wrote in my email, for all the participants, I will not be reading a written text. I have no text prepared. I just assembled some quotes. The slides are not pretty. I have also no jokes, so it will be a very unpleasant ride. For which I...
You can do some of the same jokes as I did.
Well, yeah. In any case, so be forewarned again. I will do, or what I want to attempt is a kind of something like a close reading of the reference text. So staying true to the spirit of the workshop, I want to offer maybe certain points for discussion and present more of open questions than some thesis. So I titled this assemblage of quotes with a quote from the English translation of the text, Becoming Truly Capable of Falling, Nishitani, The End of Love, which is a topic that interests me in my investigation into the work of Nishitani, how he engages with specifically the Christian idea of love, and how the idea of love, or I in Japanese, comes into contact and is transformed, if it is, by Buddhist notions of jihi or daihi, which I will not go into very much here. But surprisingly for me, in this relatively early text of Nishitani's, love is a very explicit topic in this discussion, specifically of Nietzsche. And this is what I want to focus on and look into. And again, preliminary in regard to the title, I chose the word end as a kind of ambiguous term, because I think that there's an ambiguity which we will have to look at, in that there is a question for me whether what Nishitani does with love, in his discussion of love, in his conceptualization of love, in his thinking through love, amounts to a kind of fulfillment of what love promises, and in that sense, the end as a goal of whatever love is, whatever it is that love signifies for him, or whether it is about a kind of movement of overcoming, and therefore the end of love in the sense of putting an end to love. But maybe these are also not mutually exclusive. Who knows? Well, so I will just begin by, if this is moving. Yes, by looking at the first quote from the text. Nishitani writes in a rather strange, enigmatic reference, though I make no claims to be the author of Zarathustra, I would say that all disaster and evil began by wrapping the body in clothes. Clothing beckons the need for a mirror. Since the time early humans painted their faces in clay and saw themselves mirrored in reflecting waters, the human being lost an immediate feeling of itself and obtained the now deep-rooted habit of grasping itself within the reflective eyes of others. The mirror is the universal eye of the other. How one is seen or heard has taken the place of natural being as the self's existence. Well, first, in regard to the topic of my talk, the reference to Thomas Carlyle's novel Zarathustra, or the tailor retailored, the tailor repatched, other one wants to translate this. It's interesting because a major theme of this work, which is kind of jumping ahead of what I want to get into later, is a kind of love journey of the protagonist, a German fictional doctor writing a philosophy of clothes called Teufelsdreck, meaning something literally like the devil's dung, the devil's shit, who on his journey, which is compiled in fictional biographical notes, in this novel, encounters Blumine, a beautiful woman called up, well, the woman of flower, the woman of flowers, and falls in love with her, but meets the unfortunate fate that she is taken away by a, I think, British aristocrat named Foxwood. And so this poor Teufelszeug protagonist, he falls into a very deep depression and starts wandering around. So the whole story begins as a tale of love, of failed love, of failure at love, which leads the protagonist first to experience what Carlyle describes as the everlasting nay, the experience of total negation of oneself and the world. Everything is depressing and dark, through which the protagonist, however, emerges into what then is called, I think, the zone of great indifference. And through this experience of great indifference, which follows upon the experience of the everlasting nay, finally everything is resolved by emerging again from the great indifference into the everlasting yay, which is the conclusion to the hero's journey, and which I think, for anyone familiar with Nishitani's thought, should sound, well, well, this should sound familiar, yes. Well, so there are these themes of love apparently in the background already at this stage. And then looking at this quote specifically as a starting point, I want to draw attention to this linkage of these different themes: clothing, mirroring, a logic of reflection, tied to a sense of loss, of the immediate feeling of self. And what I want to argue here, progressing into the next quotes, is that even though Nishitani introduces this as a kind of history, maybe anthropological history of, well, clothing, but beckons the need for a mirror, I think it is possible to, also in light of what follows in Nishitani's text, to flip this around and maybe in a deeper sense speak of the experience of the mirror, so the mirror as the universal eye of the other, in which the self is reflected and finds itself for the first time objectified for the other, as being, in a sense, ontologically speaking, one might say, or maybe anthropologically speaking, the first set of clothes, the first set of clothing itself, in the sense that through the reflection in the mirror, through the reflection in the eye of the other, and the experience of being exposed to the other as an image, the self is clothed in the gaze of the other. The gaze of the other, I would argue, and I think one can make this reading plausible through Nishitani, that means this function of reflection that requires the other, beckons the other, is the primordial clothes that covers this supposed nakedness of the immediate being of the self or the existence. So I would drop out this very concrete, well, reference to clothing in an ordinary sense, and rather like to introduce that gaze of the other, that is the function of reflection, as that which Nishitani here calls the clothing, or that which replaces or takes the place of natural being and existence. Well, this is my first proposal in regard to this quote, and then I want to look at the next quote where Nishitani draws a kind of conclusion from this whole logic of reflection and mirroring and clothing, where he says this kind of taking place of clothed self in the place of the immediate living self actually amounts to a dying of one's own life. So seeing one's life as one's object, meaning seeing oneself reflected in the mirror of the eye of the other, amounts to dying of one's life, which I think one can take first and foremost as this supposed dying of the immediate existence, which Einstein uses this German word for. So the immediate being, the immediate life. Now, what I want to argue here, though, is I think or what I want to disagree with would be a reading that takes Nishitani's words here too literally, in the sense that or too literally in the sense that it is about a kind of presupposition of a primordial, maybe aboriginal, as we heard yesterday, nakedness, that to which one would have to return to recover one's original life or the living life, as if the sense of what he here terms the dying of one's life in the objectification that comes through the reflective function of the mirror and the gaze of the other would be, in a certain sense, a pejorative description of this structure, of this relation. What I want to argue, or I want to contend, is that for Nishitani, this dying of one's life through the reflection and the gaze of the other in the mirror has to be radically affirmed. And the dying of one's life is actually the prerequisite for a free relation to one's own life, to the mastery of one's life, which becomes plausible without referring too much to someone like Lacan and his mirror stage conception. Becomes possible because, as Nishitani himself describes in the previously seen quote, it is only through objectifying oneself that we gain a mastery over our own image and become able to manipulate ourselves in how we see each other reflected in the gaze of others, but also how we are exposed, how we present ourselves to others. It is only by becoming an object to ourselves, mediated through the gaze of the other, that we are really able to master ourselves and present our own existence. And this requires, I would argue, precisely the dying of one's life in the sense of an objectification that for the first time allows us to properly, for better or worse, manipulate our own existence and not become victims of just our instinctual drives, to use that composition. So I would make the argument that one has to take this dying here as a positive, if anything, as a positive expression and not as a pejorative. Now, making a slight leap then into the discussion of Nietzsche in his text and the comparison or the confrontation between Zarathustra and the saint, which Zarathustra encounters on his way down the mountains just before he enters the city. There, we read of this in this confrontation, or as Nishitani's commentary in regard to the saint hidden away in these woods where Zarathustra encounters him is unaware that latent within his higher living lies the state of thoroughgoing death. Zarathustra himself did not lay his ashes to rest in the woods, but instead had to pass by the woods and on the mountain peak await a higher transfiguration, the negation of his life's negation. And this is a slight leap, of course, now, but what I want to argue from the starting point of looking at this mirror logic and the logic of the negation through reflection is that precisely what Nishitani, I think, sees in this confrontation between the saint and Zarathustra is that the saint, in a certain sense, remains at this mirror stage. He, precisely as someone who relates to the universal I of God, is clothed in an absolute sense because he has fully understood the negation of one's own life that comes with the relation to this mirroring function. I think if we look back at the first quote where Nishitani says, the mirror is the universal I of the other, I think it is very plausible to paraphrase this as God is the universal mirror. God as the universal intellect is precisely the mirror function as universal function of the other that as a reflecting function gives everyone his own image and allows everyone to reflect themselves and situate themselves proper and in relation to that universal intelligence that holds the place of the mirror. And I think this applies to this saint who has learned through his relation to this universal I of the other, namely God, that it is possible not just to negate oneself in relation to intersubjective relations to concrete others that hold this place of mirror, or just an object like the surface of the waters or a mirror made of glass and metal, but that it is possible to negate through reflection all humankind, all humanity in himself, and completely, in a certain sense, dissolve towards this mirror function of the I of the other in a universal sense. And in that sense, the saint remains, however, stuck in this relation to the mirror, whereas in contrast to that, Zarathustra, as Nishitani argues, goes even further. And I would argue, and this is what I want to continue to show, that this is the point that Nishitani is driving, the negation, even in a universal sense, in relation to this universal mirror that is the I of God, the I of this universal intelligence, the I of the absolute other, is not enough to reach a complete experience of negation that Nishitani sees in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, realized in this text at least. We have to transgress this in a further negation, which I would say, looking at the next quote of Nishitani, what does it mean? It amounts to, jumping again a little bit ahead, a negation of that mirror itself. Why? Now, Nishitani writes, what does this transfiguration mean? So this further negation that transgresses the position of the saint and amounts to the move of Zarathustra to the mountain. Instead of the self being filled by great life, as with the saint, great life fills the self. Sounds almost tautological here. But when the self is filled, the shape of the self still remains. The self is still an eidos. Here, the water of life merely fills the space of the cup. But when great life fills the self, the water of life breaks through the shape of the cup and overflows. So paraphrasing this a little bit to make it more plausible, I would say, what is the difference that is portrayed here between the saint and Zarathustra? In a certain sense, I would argue one could, from this position of mirror logic, say that precisely in learning the universal negation mediated through reference to this one universal mirror that is the absolute I of the absolute other, namely God, the saint retains an idea of image in relation to the mirror, or rather, he, in a certain sense, through learning this logic of reflection, becomes himself the mirror of the mirror, the image of the mirror, and remains stuck at the level of eidos, which is the image reflected in the mirror, but also reflected as the mirror in the mirror that is the saint himself in his unique relation to God, which requires him to identify himself completely with God, to live only in God, to live only in the mirror, through which he has learned that universal negation of his own humanity is possible. So what is described here by Nishitani as the self, or the eidos, as which the self still exists on this stage, I would argue amounts to the eidos of the mirror, the eidos of the mirroring function, a self that in a certain sense remains clothed, remains enframed, remains captured by the mirroring function, the reflection, but to a higher degree than in an ordinary way by just remaining on an intersubjective level or just as a subject, an ordinary subject of this mirroring function, by raising himself to the level of the mirror as mirror image in a double sense, that the mirror himself, the mirror itself, becomes an image that is reflected in the relation between saint and God. Whereas the mirror function is transgressed by Zarathustra, and when one can read here the water of life precisely as the water that reflects the watery surface of the mirror, the watery surface is not given as an image anymore, but the reflexive function that is instantiated in this metaphorical mirror that still takes place in the relation between saint and God is further transgressed or further negated towards a mirror without image, maybe one might say, using the same metaphor. It's a transgression of the mirror, or as we heard yesterday, a kind of immersion into the watery surface that does no longer allow for the mirror to be represented or reflected in turn by identifying with the mirror as a kind of, meta mirror that I see embodied in the saint in his exclusive relation with God. So further going in Nishitani's commentary, he says, any eidos that remains, even if the self were to become completely empty, is rejected from within. The self is no longer something substantial. Neither is it the fixed center of conscious activity. it can take on infinite Adair without ever becoming fixed, which I think further substantiates that point, that it is precisely the loss of, if one wants to translate eidos here with image, it is the loss of any image, and it is the loss of any supposition of an imaginary or image-like quality, either on the side of the subject that is reflected, nor on the side of the mirror that reflects. So precisely this supposition of a substantial image is rejected. And by that, the ability is gained to take on infinite Adair. So one is neither bound to any particular image that is given through the reflective function of the gaze of the other, of the mirrory surface, but nor is one fixed by reflecting the mirror as such as the ultimate universal singular image, as the saint does, but rather there is the possibility, as Nishitani here seems to allude to, of taking on infinite Adair without becoming fixed by any instantiation, by any eidos-like instantiation of this reflective function for which the mirror remains just a metaphor. Which is why, and I think one can link what Nishitani in this text calls sozoteki or sozo, being creative, to create, produce, whatever, to this production of eidos, the production of images. To become truly creative is to become truly capable of falling, he says, or in the Japanese, from which I took the title now of my talk, shin ni sozoteki to naru to wa shin ni botsuraku shiuru mono to naru koto de. And well, I think one can paraphrase this in line of this interpretation of this reading in the sense, again, that creation here amounts to the production of images through the reflective function, which is liberated by transgressing the mirror, in the sense that one is no longer bound to or dependent on the mirror surface giving oneself one's own image to which one remains fixed, nor to the representation of the mirror itself in any metaphorical or imaginary way, by identification with this universal reference point, through which, or mediated through which, everything as a totality can become negated and receive its proper image, precisely by becoming able of what Nishitani here calls botsuraku. And it is translated as falling, but I think one could also, in the sense of the Nietzschean Untergang, could translate it as remaining true to the image of watery surface, maybe as drowning. One can become truly capable of drowning, namely in the watery surface that makes the mirror, to drown in the water of the mirror, just as we heard yesterday in reference to the myth of Narcissus. When one becomes truly capable of drowning, so to immerse oneself in the reflective function for which the mirror remains just a metaphor, just another image among others, one can become truly creative in the sense that Nishitani speaks of infinite Adair without ever becoming fixed. So we lose any absolute or universal reference point for this mediating reflective function that produces the images. And again, botsuraku, so falling, drowning, this step beyond the metaphor of the mirror, the instance of the mirror, the universal reference point of the absolute I of the other, the universal eye or gaze of the other, that is supposed to clothe everything properly in its own image, is necessary. For which reason Nishitani continues, all true creating is completed in true falling, and true falling can only be attained by a truly creative living. Again, seems like a tautology. That is the final leap of creating, a progression, one step beyond one's peak. This is why a life's absolute negation of itself is at the same time its absolute affirmation. Only here can what we earlier called thoroughgoing death turn into a thoroughgoing living. So again, what I would say here is, as a commentary, or an attempt at explicating, unpacking this a little bit, is that this final leap of creating and progression beyond one's peak exactly corresponds to this transgression of the saint that remains stuck at the peak, meaning remains stuck at his identification or relation to the mirror as image, to the mirror as the image of God, as the universal reference point, which is as a kind of supreme image, the model and the exemplary or the supreme example for every image, the key metaphor to hold all metaphors. Beyond that, to a unbound multiplicity, maybe one could say, of images, to infinite images, to use again the term of Nishitani, which is no longer bound by any universal reference point that serves as an exemplary model by which to judge and situate all the images. That is no longer supposed as, in a certain sense, the one true image, one might even say, or supposed as this the naked frame to enframe all beings with their image, to use another metaphor. Well, then again, a slight jump from this mirror logic and reflective logic to what interests me in the subtitle. Nishitani says, going a little bit into the historical circumstance of Nietzsche and referencing Hegel, that in any case, what is interesting is that Nietzsche's Zarathustra, just like Hegel's religious critics, attempted to express the self's basic disposition, which I think is a translation of the Japanese kyochi, if I remember correctly, with the word love, I, in Japanese. What I take love to mean here in this context is, again, I would say the basic capability for the subject to enter this reflective function or into relation with the reflective function, or to put it more easily, to relate to the other. It might be another person, it might be another subject, it might be another thing like the watery surface, it might be God, but to enter into relation in a very loose sense, first and foremost, to relate, the capability to relate. I would provisionally argue that one can take love to mean. And as Nishitani notes here, it's indeed interesting that in the 19th century, this enigmatic signifier of love assumes prominence in philosophical discourse, but also in literary discourse. And love becomes all the rage in the sense that it seems that indeed the self's basic disposition, and then again, of course, in later years, in later decades, even more so with the psychoanalytic turn in cultural studies and whatever, the basic desiring quality of the subject and the overriding quality of love as the basic capability to relate to anything at all, indeed assumes a certain relevance in discourse, exceptionally so. Well, then again, returning to this problem of the saint, Nietzsche, I cut this quote short, this commentary from Nishitani, draws a contrast between, Nietzsche points to the saint's Achilles heel, which remains by the fact that even love for God, so the relation to God, or again, the universal I, or that is the universal mirror function, as noted above, has a halfway quality, as coming to rest halfway through the dialectical movement of life. It stops at this universal reference point by instantiating the universal I as a kind of absolute image of this mirror function, is how I would paraphrase this. And therefore it remains stuck or in a kind of fixed love relation, whereby love and relation can be taken almost synonymously, by relating to this absolute point that seems to be the necessary mediating point and necessary reference for the universal negation of everything or anything at all, especially humanity. Now then, just going a bit further in this confrontation between the saint and Zarathustra, encountering him on the way down the mountain, the confrontation where the saint tells him to give human beings not even arms. Zarathustra answers, no, I do not give alms, for that I'm not poor enough. When Nishitani comments on this, we could say that these ironic words show the reverse side of the halfway quality of loving God. They seem to mean that when one's life has not yet become overflowing will, one tries to supplement one's own inner unfulfillment through others, as with so-called neighborly love. Even in neighborly love, one speculates that by warming others, one's own chilly poverty will be warmed. Which is interesting, again, on many levels, what Nishitani is doing here, in the sense, or what Nietzsche is doing and how Nishitani comments on Nietzsche, in that one can see that here in this halfway quality that Nishitani still sees exemplified in the love of the saint for God, there is, again, a reflective logic exemplified in this reciprocal relation of the attempt to supplement one's own unfulfillment, and doing so by relating to the other, from which one in turn, in this relation, receives that which one gives. So there's this economic exchange dimension, which maps onto, I would say, this mutual reflection that I see in the higher life of the saint, who, by reflecting the reflective function of the mirror itself, gives an image to God, gives an image to this universal reference point of the mirror, and becomes the mirror of the mirror, if one wants to say so, lives only to God, lives only in this relation to God, and receives what he gives. He receives, in a certain sense, if one translates this, warming others and becoming warmed in turn, getting warmed in turn. He receives the same image of the mirror that he gives to the mirror by relating to God as this absolute reference point of mediation. And again, looking at the sentence before, the unfulfillment is supplemented, which is an experience, I would say, of privation, negation of privation, that is supposed in the sense of there is a sense of a contingent lack of unfulfillment that is supplemented through relation, through the love, to the reference point of the other, in which one supposes the original fulfillment that oneself perceives as lacking through this contingent negation. In other words, in the logic of negation that is still at work in the stage of the mirroring reflective function, one can only speak of negation as a contingent secondary event that can be overcome by entering into this fixed relation to a certain stable reference, and in this reference receiving that which one is contingently so lacking by giving, by this entering this economic of exchange, the economy of exchange, or this mutual reflection, or raising the reflective function to the value of an image inside this reflection. This is how I would paraphrase this. But I would like to lay emphasis on this logic of supplementation that seems to imply that negation here is something secondary or contingent that can be overcome through entering this reflective function. Again, against this, through the transgression of the mirror, Zarathustra tries to carry his fire into the valley, as it is written. His fire was not one meant to warm the self and other, so not to stabilize this mutual reflection, but was one that set them ablaze. It was the fire of absolute negation of the human being's human nature, its all too human part, and likewise a negation of its dependence on God, which only repeats the earlier point that Zarathustra precisely, he transgresses not just in a universal negation all the images that are given in a reflective function in relation to the mirror that is supposed, for example, as the perfect being of God and his all-seeing eye, but he even transgresses or cuts this relation to the supposed supreme other, supreme being, the image of the mirror as the supreme image, and goes even further in his negation to the so-called absolute negation, where he, this seems to be the suggestion, leaves even this economic logic of exchange and supplementation, meaning he transgresses precisely negation, I would argue now, as a contingent privation, and therefore as something that could be undone or that could be supplemented or could be, how to say, could be reversed. Therefore, absolute negation. Now, just a few more quotes before I come to the end. To make the negation of human nature absolute, Nishitani continues, even the human nature contained within its dependence on God must be negated. When human nature is negated and yet God is still clung to, we are still on the way to an absolute negation, siva affirmation. Meaning, I would say what this negation, this famous Soku negation, siva affirmation in this context might mean is negation on the level of the saint, when it is still not absolute, because it is still, it only takes place in the relation to God, is still instantiated in a representational logic, or in the supposition that God is the source of negation. He is, in a certain sense, for one, as the absolute I of the other that reflects myself, and therefore is able to negate myself, the source of negation, but also that which can supplement absolutely what I am lacking in relation, contingently lacking in relation to this supposed perfect being. Whereas the transgression towards the absolute negation, sive affirmation, then would be an entering into negation, or a way of relating through negation that no longer instantiates this negation or the reflective function of negation in any image, be it even not in this absolute universal reference point that would be God as the absolute other, the absolute I of the other, the universal I of the other. Even that is transgressed, and negation itself is absolutely affirmed as this reflective movement itself. Now, for this reason, and Nishitani continues, even neighborly love must be transmuted into a new shape. Love of one's neighbor, those who are closest, must be turned into a love of those farthest. An immediately granted affirmation of human nature must be turned into an absolute negative affirmation. The fire of Zarathustra carries into the valleys was a fire of love for those farthest. Now, what I want to propose here as a reading again is only that I would say one would make a mistake in the interpretation of Nietzsche, but also I think of Nishitani's reading of Nietzsche that he proposes in his text, when one takes this love of those farthest as someone else than the neighbor. Rather, I would say the love of those farthest is precisely Nietzsche's interpretation, or Nishitani's interpretation of the neighbor. Why? Because I would say that in raising negation to the level of the absolute, what is negated and affirmed in this negation sive affirmation is precisely the quality of the neighbor in being far always already, by sharing in this not just contingent negation, but precisely in this negativity that is the reflective movement as primordial, as that which is truly absolute, without any supposition of any representationally available or supposable instantiation of, for example, a mirror as image, a watery surface, or whatever metaphor one wants to use. Put differently, I would say that the neighbor can become or can be seen precisely as the farthest, insofar as one recognizes in the neighbor this dimension of the negativity that always already has privated or affected the being of the neighbor, just as the being of oneself, with negativity, with privation, or with what I would like rather to call a certain dimension of lack. And as Nishitani continues, even the words God is dead must be understood in the above sense. They can be interpreted as indicating an abyss in one's life, an abyss that has yet to manifest in a life, described as facing God or having love for God. That is a life that dies as a human being to be born toward God, like the saint, one might say. Even a life that is described as a unity with God does not encounter this abyss. Well, and I think what this abyss, which even affects God, means is precisely the abyss of the reflective function, that is the abyss of this movement of negation in the reflection that is first and foremost, or zunächst und zumeist, supposed to have a source in some universal and absolute being like God, or is just ordinarily supposed in the intersubjective relation between different others, or in the relation to things like mirror surfaces or whatever, but when raised to the absolute level, can only be recognized as an abyss that always essentially already belongs not just to human subjects, but also to God himself. And it is precisely, I would argue then, a question of turning the love or the capability to relate not towards any being, but precisely to that which is always already lacking in these beings, and what makes them capable not just of being negated, but reflectively also negating the other. Therefore, this is the last quote, and thereby I will come to my end. What he demands then, namely Zarathustra, Nietzsche, but also Nishitani reading them, as the final transfiguration of love, is a transfiguration away from the final schism, bundetsu, of a life facing God, resting in God, or unifying with God. He demands the self-presentation of a life's deepest oneness. And this oneness, I think, it also came up yesterday in the discussion. What this oneness means, therefore, I think, is not a form of wholeness or totality that is reached by relation between things that form a totality or a multitude that sustains each other in being. That would be precisely the level of the saintly view of the world, where everything is interdependent, co-arising, and sustaining each other in an economy of exchange, where everyone receives what they give. But what this oneness amounts to, I think, is precisely the raising of a contingent negativity experienced only as privation that can be redeemed or that can be exchanged in this economy of relation to a constitutive lack that always already belongs necessarily on an ontological level, if one still wants to use that term, to any being whatsoever, and marks them always already by being affected with this reflective function of the negativity that can no longer be represented by any, not even universal and absolute singular metaphor like God, or represented in any exceptional exemplary image like it would be in the relation between the saint and God. Therefore, this transfiguration of this final schism, which is ironic that he uses the term bundetsu here, because all the other, it sounds paradoxical, because precisely facing or resting in God or unifying with God seems to be the opposite of schism. But precisely the transfiguration away from the final schism, I would argue, therefore, with Nishitani, is, again, speaking on the same line, paradoxically, it's not so much the move away from that schism, but it is precisely a move into that schism as a move into that abyss of which he spoke earlier in regard to the fathers, namely a recognition of the constitutive lack in being that always already marks anything with negativity, and therefore oneness, which is identical to this schism in the sense that it marks the oneness of being and nothingness, or the original emptiness of everything, meaning a primordial schism that is the imageless, if one wants to say, the imageless origin of what he earlier portrayed as the mirror. And I think therein fulfills itself this movement of what Nishitani describes as the saintly love, or the capability of relating, that is raised to its highest potential in the saint, and then even transgressed in the ability of someone like Zarathustra to fall into the abyss, to transgress the mirror, and to reach that stage of infinite images that are no longer have any reference or anchorage in something that is. That's my proposal for reading this logic of love and back. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Tobias. Before to go into the discussion, I have first of all to ask Professor Moore. Professor Moore, if you can hear me, as you see, we are very late because discussion was very interesting and moving. I forgot to watch the clock. So, Professor Moore, I would ask you, is it good for you if we discuss 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then go to your talk? Do you have enough time, or is better that, because I don't know how your situation is, or is it better that you give your talk soon, and then we can discuss later, Tobias? And this is first. Second, Kato-san, もし午後に移ってもらっていいですか? So probably we have to move the talk of Kato-san in the afternoon. Probably we could start 30 minutes before as scheduled. But first, Professor Moore, is okay? Please tell me really freely if you prefer to give your presentation soon, or if we can have a discussion.
I'm happy to wait. Yeah, I'm looking forward to discussing this excellent paper. So I'm happy to wait. I have time.
Okay, perfect. So we can enter into discussion. カトさん、じゃあお願いします。でも30分前に午後は2時半からまだ始めて。Okay. So You can open the discussion with Tobias. If no one has a discussion, really, since yesterday, I have in my so I would like to show you a passage of Nishitani from Zen no Tachiba, where he speaks about the mirror effect that I use during my lesson in order to explain what is the pure experience of Nishida is. For GQ, then quello che mi serve per Luca.
It's okay. Have fun.
So this is of course a later study, but in order to, I want to ask you first, yes, what you try to talk about the difference between 合一 union 一つになる、一致にする oneness, because at least in my opinion, this could be a good passage to understand the difference. Nishitani is speaking about the everyday experience of looking your own face in a mirror. そう、我々は普段自分の顔を鏡に映してみるときには、そのことに注意しない、そのことに、distinction between subject and object in modern philosophy, this was the topic. So when we look our face in a mirror or reflected in a mirror, could be good to understand the relation between the duality, subject and object. 少なくともそのことに注意を集中されるということは稀である。But it's something that is not rare. And しかしそれにもかかわらず、いつでも鏡の中の自分を見ているその自分が、but anyway, every time we look ourselves into the mirror, 逆に鏡の中の自分から見られているのである。On the contrary, we are seen from ourselves into the mirror. So when we look ourselves into the mirror, ourselves into the mirror is looking to us, and we are feel looked from ourselves. And 自分を見ているその自分の目を注意して疑似すれば、自分も鏡の中から疑似される。So when we look, or probably there is better verb in English, stare, I don't know, 疑似する. When we exactly look with attention, our eye into the mirror, we are looked from this eye. Okay? そのことに気がつく瞬間, this is important, in the instant, in the moment that we are aware of this fact, 誰でもいくらか変な気持ちになるであろう. So everyone is so feel uncomfortable in this kind of. そこに成立している事柄は鏡の中の自分を観察するという事柄とは全く違っている. So this kind of experience, to look exactly our eyes into the mirror is not simply to look yourself as an object into the mirror. そこには鏡の内と外という区別はもはやない。So in this moment, in this instant, there is no more difference between inside and outside. 内が外で、外が内である。So the inside is outside, the outside, and the outside is the inside. So first, I use this passage of Nishitani to explain the first part, the starting point of the Zen no Kenkyu of Nishida. But anyway, I think this could be a good example of the difference between Goitsu, unity, and Ichi, hitotsu ni naru, where this kind of difference is no more aware. So this is the first question for you, Tobias. I would like to ask if you agree somehow with this, my interpretation. But secondly, I would add to another point to your talk. The example of the mirror is actually you are always looking to yourself. It could be also similar, for example, to Orthodox icon aesthetics, that you look into the eye of Jesus and you are looked by Jesus, like in Andrei Rublev or Andrei Tarkovsky, for example. But here is, I want to make another passage from Hakuin. It is, for me, very interesting, from a text of Hakuin that is, what is, in English is Zen words for the Dokugo Shinkyo, so gift words for, it's an interpretation of the sutra in a chapter when Hakuin is commenting a passage of the sutra that say they are not born, so fuse, not destroyed, fumetsu, not stained, not pure, they do not increase or decrease. This is the passage of the sutra. And Hakuin make this strange comment. I read the English translation. Real front page stuff, but is that really the way it is? How did you hit on that part about everything being not born and not destroyed? You'd better not swindle us. An elbow doesn't bend outward. But now the point is interesting. And he said, make a poetic commentary and writes, the little chaps in your eyes are awaiting their guests. The valid spirit, so the echo, isn't dead. She expects your call. So the point is, the little chaps in your eyes are awaiting their guests. The little chaps in your eyes is your own image reflected in the eye of the other. So the commentary is, that is, by the way, is the original meaning of pupil. You know that pupil means, pupil means a small doll, your own image in the eye of the other. And there, exactly, and there is a commentary, essay, notes. The little chaps are eye babies, so reflected in the eye. This is a commentary of the note of from Hakuin. Working freely and mindlessly, they show all things as they truly are. And the valid spirit is the echo. Though void of any fixed substance or self, it responds instantly when someone calls out. So these two lines illustrate the true principle of not born, not destroyed. Okay, this is the commentary. So when we watch ourselves in the mirror, we are is something related to ourselves. But if I look myself into your eyes, so the mirror is you. You are, and I look myself through your eyes, reflected into your eyes. So you spoke about the relation between God eyes as absolute mirror. Yes, of course, is a good thing, good example. But this is a very common experience that we do every day. It's not only with the eye of God. I can see me reflected into your eyes, or Soba's eye, but also in the eye of a cat or of an animal or a dog, as we spoke yesterday. So just to ask you, what do you think? Because, for example, how deep is the relation of Nishitani in this text to Zen Buddhism? I asked myself, because it's 1938, I'm not sure that Nishitani was so related with Buddhism in that period. But at the time of Zen no Tachiba, of course, the title is Zen no Tachiba. So is it possible that somehow the point of view of Nishitani developed Zen no Tachiba going through Zen Buddhism? And in this case, so God is no more so the only eyes in which we can make this interrelation.
Can I ask, you talk about seeing seeing yourself in the eye of the other? Is it just yourself you see, or do you see something about yourself that you might hope for in the future, or something that maybe you never saw before? Instead of seeing the reflection of what you already know. I mean, do you learn anything? I say that because there's this beautiful image in Nikos Kazantzakis. He has two scorpions playing on the sand, and they're about to mate. And the female looks in the eyes of the male and sees reflected little children playing, little baby scorpions playing. And the male looks in the eyes of the female and sees death. Yeah, the mystery of love. So the point is, in looking at the other, maybe in a mirror, you look at yourself, you don't see anything that you don't already see. Whereas in the other, you may see something completely different, or know something about yourself you would not otherwise know.
That is a good point, but sorry. For example, Nishitani wrote about the meaning of the encounter. Probably to see your image into the other reality is another way to speak about this.
Sorry, I think Lorenzo has some compliments as well, but if I understand well when I read that as well, because when you see yourself reflected in the eye of the other, you are not only seeing your own reflection, but also the reaction that the other person is showing when you are appearing in front of him. You know what I mean? So I'm looking at my eyes are not that good, but I'm looking at myself in your eyes, but I'm also looking at your own face on the reaction you're doing by looking at me and stuff. So if I understand well, you're learning something. Relating to Jim's question, but sorry, I think Lorenzo has something to complement it, right? It's related or? It's up to you.
Okay.
Because it's a beautiful page, and it's fun for me because like having these. Oh, I'm not looking at myself in the mirror. It's the person in the mirror looking at me. Probably, I don't think Nishitani is actually quoting from Akutagawa, but it's one of the key passages in Hana, Story of the Nose, in which like the Heian Jedi, like this monk has a huge nose and he's obsessed by the gaze of others. And at one point he gets rid of the nose with a very gruesome treatment and so on. He looks at the mirror, and Akutagawa's sentence is a bit weird because he says, oh, and then the monk, the person in the mirror was looking at him with a very satisfied face. And so like, when we have so like, from Nishitani, this is kind of a granted situation. So I look at the mirror and there is this moment of non-distinction. This is not only like the history of the Hana is like a very unhappy history of like being oneself, constantly feeling oneself in its own body through the gaze of the others, even when they're not there physically. And even in the moment in which the Naigu, I mean, Zenshi Naigu is the name of the monk, even in the moment in which his body is like kind of conforming, he sees himself from outside. And in Kimura Bin, these being unable to perceive one's body as a subject, so like having the only perception available, or like somebody whose only perception of the body is like as körper, something seen from the outside, is tendentially schizophrenic, which also could be like a very early diagnosis already in 16 for Akutagawa. So he, Natsume Soseki was writing a little press note for the story, and he was saying, well, if you hold yourself, that's really interesting because it's also one little note about the eyes. And he was saying, well, if you keep holding the others within your own eyes, I mean, not to constantly hold the others within your eyes, it's stupidness. It means it's better for you if you don't do it. So like these reflection, I mean, because we're focusing on the mystical things, or even like Alessandro was talking about a positive narcissism and so on. But then there are many ways of reflection, and many ways of reflecting actually are very objectifying. So that's one issue I'm having in this moment. We were stressing this kind of overflowing and so on, but very often we are trapped within mirrors. And I would say usually now it's not even reflecting surface, we're just like objectified by, it's more of a picture. We are like it's a camera, it's a streaming, it's a picture. Very, very often we fail to subjectivize ourselves because these movements can be very objectifying. I think it's funny that Tagawa was using the very same image, maybe 20 years before Nishitani, and he might have read it. But it's to have the person in the mirror looking at yourself is like it's mostly disquieting. I don't recognize myself. I get simply lost, and it's very often true in social occasions. What do you think, Tobias?
Partly
alienating, as a simply alienating experience.
Yes, this maybe in continuing this alienating or uncanny experience in front of the mirror, which I think is crucial to understand also what Nishitani is doing, and therefore also in response to your remarks, is because first to start again from Nishitani, he introduces this whole mirror dynamic by pointing to this problem of clothing, and that beckons the need of a mirror, and that this, however, is, as he says, I would say that all disaster and evil began by wrapping the body in clothes, and by inference, that means all disaster and evil began with the mirror. The mirror is the origin of all disaster and evil, which I think connects to these themes that you alluded to with alienation and so on. Because I think this whole dimension of intersubjectivity, of course, I didn't want to say that only God is in the mirror, not at all. But rather, this is exactly as he says, this is the most common experience. But from there, the saint in Nietzsche's scheme, he understands precisely this logic of this intersubjective, or not even intersubjective, this reflective logic of mirroring, and raises it to the level of the supreme universal referent in God, and is thereby able to overcome his mere humanity, or just this ordinary life, trapped in with Eliot, you could say, the wilderness of mirrors. And he raises this to the level of the absolute mirror of all mirrors, the absolute reflecting point, but still obeys the same logic. And what is this logic? And I think it entails this moment of uncanniness or alienation, precisely insofar as it is not reducible to, as Nishitani kind of mockingly says in the end, this mutual reciprocal warming each other by this mutual recognition and loving attention for each other's image, and this mutual reflection that supplements each other, be it on the level of intersubjectivity in an ordinary sense, or in this absolute higher elevated sense of the saint's relation to his absolute other, that is God, the universal I of reflection. It is not reducible to that, because I think the most uncanny experience is when you realize in front of the mirror image that no one is looking at you. The mirror image does not see you. You can see yourself through the mirror, but the one who is looking at you from the mirror sees nothing. The eye is your eye that is reflected, but the reflected eye itself is no gaze, or rather is not the eye looking at you. Rather, it is, you could say, it is your gaze, but outside of you, reflected at you.
Yeah. So and therefore, don't you think that's what Hakuin says is even more deeper? Because in the case of the encounter with the eye of the other, you look yourself in the eye of the other, but at the same time, the other is watching you and looking herself or himself into your eyes. And there's no more.
And you know he's looking.
Exactly.
It's different from the mirror, right? Because the mirror, you know, he or she's not looking at you, right?
So in this sense, so there is a slight difference.
Gap. Yes, there is a gap. Yes, exactly. There is a gap. Yes, there is a gap, and there's an abyss to with Nishitani, or there's a schism involved in the scheme. But I think it's not very easy to situate that schism properly in that reflective logic. But I would lay emphasis, or this is how I would think, I would lay emphasis on this point that, well, for one, there is some uncanniness in this alienation, in that also coming from a different angle, that as Nishitani introduces also here, the self-mastery, or the ability to objectify oneself and properly expose oneself in a self-conscious way, is mediated by this function, precisely in the sense that I receive myself through the other, through the eye of the other, through that mirroring gaze. I cannot even relate to myself without the mediation through that point. But this point at the same time, and this is what I would see as the second level of uncanniness, not just does this other hold my image in a certain sense hostage, not just do I only receive myself back from the other when I also give my attention to the other in this reciprocal reflection, but at the same time, again, and I would stress this, the other is not alive. The mirror is not alive. He's not someone who sees me. The mirror sees nothing. And I think there's a later passage in a dialogue. There's a later passage in a dialogue with Yagi Seiichi, where in a very interesting way, in the context of discussing the relation of Buddhism and Christianity, again, this very, and Zen Buddhism, very old and common metaphor of the mirror comes up. And the encounter between the two Zen masters is by Nishitani explained as a relation of two mirrors facing each other. But he says this is not the end. It is not about two mirrors mutually reflecting themselves as reflecting each other. But what he aims at, he says so explicitly in that dialogue, is a mirror that no longer reflects anything, but in a certain sense is a dark mirror, a mirror in absolute darkness that does not carry any image, and that does not even carry the image of the mirror itself. And this dark mirror, I would say, is precisely when one pushes this uncanniness to the limit, this alienation to the limit, what one arrives at, when one realizes that precisely at this point of reflection, there is no one looking. The point at which my gaze returns to me is precisely a point of death, or maybe not death, but a point of unbornness that is always already outside of me and holds myself hostage. And in that sense, I would read Nishitani's attempt to, in a certain sense, transgress a false conception of this reflective logic that is too much bound up in a metaphorical sense of the mirror, in the sense that it is not about this intersubjective reciprocal relation to someone or something that I encounter and which I can in turn reflect as having a certain frame, a certain image that is, for example, a water surface with a certain material quality, with a certain imaginary consistency. The mirror itself is absolutely inconsistent, I would say, and not just inconsistent, but it appears precisely as this constitutive lack that always already pushes me outside of myself and belongs to me. And in that sense, maybe, I'm not sure if this came up, in that sense constitutes my oneness, because it is always already as this negativity constitutive of my being that I only receive from this negative dimension that constitutes, and not as contingent privation, but as a constitutive lack my being, as my constitutive emptiness. This is how I would read this. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, how can I relate this emptiness? And to pick up just shortly my title, I think there this ambiguity arises. Can I love this lack, this constitutive lack? Can I enter a relation to this lack? Or is this a kind of non-relationality? Is this something that ends the love, where love has to end because I can no longer representationally reciprocate with it? Or is this the ultimate end as the aim and the final goal, the absolute peak, so to speak, of that love? I would rather argue for the first option. It is the end of all loving relation. It's the end of relation. You cannot have any positive relation with this lack. It is just empty of itself and of myself. I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but in any case, I would point also to this very interesting passage at the beginning of the dialogue with Yagi Seiichi.
Two more things, and again, they're both Zen adjacent, because there's a Zen saying, and I think at one point, I don't remember the passage, but I think I found it in Nishitani the first time, which sounds more or less like the eye doesn't see the eye, and that's what makes it an eye. So like already this kind of alienation is not, so that we might think that the alienation is in the mirror stage, but actually the fact, in order to be visible, in order to have vision, I need to have a core of blindness at the core of the activity in itself, which is only revealed by this kind of exteriorization, this kind of negation into mirror.
Yeah.
So I mean, like by making my eye visible, the mirror is not just a symbol of vision. It makes visible my inner blindness effects. I will not be able, if I see myself in the mirror, I realize, oh, I don't see myself.
Yes. This is exactly what I want. Yes.
You never see yourself, right?
So if not for the mirror, so the mirror is like myself, seeing myself, unlike I would normally do.
Yes.
That's why it's the connection with death and truth and negation. And the other point, I mean, what we're saying in the dialogue, I mean, it's very much, it might be like a half explicit reference to the 2 poems and the history of Vinay, the six-patriarch. So like with the literate monk, like making a wonderful poem about body, and so we have to polish the mirror, which again is like and I said, well, where the mirror is not there, where should the dust could be covered by dust? So like at one point, the fact that this thing is at the same time it's a symbol of truth.
Yeah.
But also like the mirror image is fake.
Exactly.
It's like a already in place. They're not using these the mirrors, but this concept. What's the status of an image?
Yes.
How an image can be faithful. So like at one point, the mirror is a negation of our sight, and at the same time, our sight has this inner relationship that seems also to be eventually creating a state of reflection. But isn't this kind of like disappearing mirror, like the broken mirror, or like as we jump into the water, this is just like a simplified state of oneness, or like by being a broken mirror, we already are going. The kind of negation is somehow integrated in this like moment of oneness.
Well, first, thank you for this reference. Yes, this is exactly. This is, I think, it maps perfectly onto Nishitani's discussion here of Nietzsche and the encounter between Zarathustra and the saint, because it's exactly this. The saint is polishing the mirror. The saint is the one who is polishing his God mirror and is keeping it clean and perfect, and supposes it as this primordial nakedness that he, in a certain sense, this primordial perfect image, with which, if entered into a relation, he can sustain his own purity, his own being. He's, in a certain sense, then also polishing his own image, in front of the mirror. But yes, in any case, exactly. And the point would be that Zarathustra amounts to the one who says there is no mirror. But yes, and then this is how I would. This is an open question. Then what does this constitutive lack amount to? So this immersion into the water, the destruction of the mirror, the breaking of the mirror, or this complete darkness of the mirror, when the mirror stops reflecting anything, or rather when the mirror image is revealed as being empty, the mirror is revealed as being empty in the sense that it reflects that I do not see anything. It reveals only my own blindness. What happens at that moment? And I think that this is very much tied to what Nishitani here calls Botsura. So this Untergang in the Nietzschean sense, drowning, a moment of what I earlier called inconsistency. It is constitutive, but it is inconsistent. It's an inconsistent being. And I'm not sure how far one has to take this, but it seems to me that this has to be taken in a very radical sense as being, well, it is a certain form of, I would say it is a certain form of yes. Well, yes, I don't know.
But nevertheless, I agree with you. But nevertheless, I think you still use too much the word I. So I don't see anything in this moment. So the problem is that there is no more I. So what Nishitani is saying, so in this instant, in this moment, there is the regime of representation. So the idea of represent something dissolves. So not only there is no mirror and there is no reflective image, but there is no more I who I'm looking into the mirror.
Or the mirrors.
Exactly. So the point is, I think the image of the mirror here is very fit to understand what Nishida calls Miru mono naki miru mono. That is the point of the central stage of Nishida. So in this moment, there is only one seeing or seer. There is no more me. There is a verb. Is not more something that is objectified, something seen and seer. But there is a seeing without anything seen or anything seen. But Hakuin, I think what Hakuin is saying is more similar to the late Nishida, because if the mirror are the eyes of the other as a metaphor, so it's no more the problem of miru mono naki miru mono, but is the alterity is involved, the plurality of the other are involved. It's no more I can say an unconscientialist approach to the question. But yes, therefore I agree, and I think, for example, another reference to Buddhism, Shobogenzo. What is the eye that can see the Dharma?
Well, yes,
It is the point. It's like the same. Huinen will say there is no mirror. So if there is no mirror, which eyes, or whose eye is seeing the real Dharma? This is the point.
If I may react to this, I think yes, yes, you're right in saying that the overemphasis of I and thou at this point, I don't think is justified. But I would identify then this seeing without seer precisely with Nishitani here, coming from this quote, with this what he calls this final schism. Which I say is not what he says paradoxically, though my interpretation seems to go against the literal wording of his text when he says we have to move away from the schism that is realized in unity. But then my point would be, yes, we have to move from a schism that is represented as in this unification, as even in a reconciled form, as a relation between something that can be supposed as being consistently in a relation, towards the pure schism as such, where I think the seeing without seer is realized precisely in this gap, or as this gap, as this schism, or using Shobogenzo, the empty flower. What is the eye that sees? It is the sick eye. It is the eye that is the eye of a sick man that doesn't see properly, that sees the flowers in the sky, or the flowers of emptiness, because it is clouded. It is broken. It is a broken gaze. And in that sense, yes, I think it is maybe even more the late Nishida. It has more the quality of this pure place of topos that is always already, again, with Nishitani, a kind of abyss. And it has an abysmal, non-grounding inconsistency to it. It is an inconsistent sick gaze in which it is reflected ultimately.
And what is also probably interesting for your talk, that when the late Nishida tried to think this kind of relation with the other, the topic of love comes. Because of course, if it's a kind of pan-conscientialism, there is no other. So who do you love if there is only a subject that mirrors itself, and the mirror yourself, maybe in a narcissistic sense? But anyway, Professor Moore was wanted to interview, and then I think after Professor Moore question, we have to move to Professor Moore talk. Professor Moore, please.
Yeah, is there a time? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you. I have a couple questions about precedents. If not so much in this text, I do think they're in this text, then maybe as productive ways in which to develop what you're thinking. And first of all, in terms of breaking this economy of exchange or this reciprocal mirroring, I'm thinking about Eckhart's use of the word entbilden. So a kind of deformation or de-imaging, which seems to me to be operative in this text when he's talking about a kind of breaking down of representation. And what's interesting there is this process of deformation is supposed to get us to a place in which, using this explosive metaphor, the eye with which God sees me is the eye with which I see God. So I'm wondering how you understand that idea, where actually there's just one eye, EYE, there's just one seeing, And so there's no longer kind of mirroring, but he's still using this language of seeing. And the second precedent I was thinking about is Schelling, or the theosophical tradition more broadly, going back to Burma. And here thinking about Einbilden or Einbildungskraft, not so much as a kind of human faculty of imagination, but rather as an informing, a sort of. So then I'm thinking about the way in which we're supposed to take on these multiple ede in a sort of non-mirroring way, in a way that doesn't depend on something that's being mirrored. And so I'm just wondering whether you think something like that is operative here, that once we enter into this sort of state, once we negate the negation, then there's the possibility of hineinbilden, of sort of einbilden, a sort of creating of images from out of this abyss. Could you hear me? Was that okay?
Yes. Thank you very much for these comments. Well, in regard to, I only focused on the first third of Nishitani's text. I didn't touch upon Eckhart, but I do definitely think that this corresponds perfectly. So this whole rhetoric of the Einbilden and the whole shedding the images of God, this I think can be mapped onto precisely this reflective logic that is developed in the beginning of the text in this relation. And in this explosive metaphor, as you called it, where there is only one gaze remaining, well, it remains then also, but still an open question whether this mystical experience that Eckart is driving at is indeed essentially then is the same that Nishitani tries to draw out from Zarathustra, or that can be relate to these Zen experiences of what we just thematized as a kind of broken gaze, or an inconsistent gaze, or a kind of primordial lack or constitutive lack that I see Nishitani emphasizing in this discussion of Nietzsche. And I tend to separate the two in the sense that I do think that also Nishitani in his later discussion of Eckart, and he devoted many pages to Eckart explicitly. I think he rather reaches a different conclusion, that this Eckartian kind of mysticism cannot be the endpoint that he himself is driving at, because he does rather in this schema here and of this text remain at this kind of saintly level of a kind of reciprocity, even if Eckart tries to reach a point in the Godhead that is before creation, before even the abolition of the Trinitarian person, that is in a certain sense still enfolded in itself and has not yet gone out of itself or out of its ground. But I don't think that this ground has the same abysmal quality that one finds in someone like Schelling, who rather emphasizes the self-enclosed evil nature of the ground, the abysmal ground, as the origin of all disaster and evil, as Nishitani speaks of here. And I think Nishitani would situate himself and align himself much more closely, therefore, with these philosophical attempts at looking at the abyss, rather than the Ungrund or the Abgrund that one finds in Eckart's thought of the Godhead. Because I don't think, even if one pushes Eckart very far, Eckart would be willing to situate evil in such a radical sense in the Godhead. That I think would even go too far for Eckartian mysticism. But one, of course, finds this in this also dialectic of ground and existence in Schelling, for example, coming from the Böhmian tradition. In Böhme, I think he, because also of his closeness to more hermetic traditions and a different kind of spirituality that is even farther removed than Eckart from Orthodox Christian visions of God, I think align much better with what Nishitani is trying to do from his Zen Buddhist inspired background, because they emphasize precisely also this, well, in a moral sense, ambiguity and schism that is at play or at work in this conception of the absolute. Yeah, so I would again, for this contextualization, yes, I would highlight the greater affinity and alignment with this Böhme Schellingian line in the background of Nishitani, who had already in the late 30s extensively worked on Schelling and was well familiar with the Schellingian idea of, well, ground and Ungrund and Abgrund and all of this rhetoric and vocabulary, rather than what he tries to draw out of Eckart. I think this is, but then again, it makes it interesting, and this is in a certain sense my interest also personally in looking at these texts, how when Nishitani speaks in the end of a transfiguration or transmutation of love, in reference to Christian mysticism of Eckart, how is this a strategic attempt to, in a certain sense, strategically transform and transfigure the orthodox idea of love and lead, in a certain sense, this still belonging to an orthodox frame, or being able to be situated in an orthodox frame of Christian spirituality, out of that frame to a different experience that is closer to what philosophically was conceived of by Schelling, for example, or that is closer to the original Zen Buddhist experience. That's kind of at the background of my thought, how this talk of transfiguration and transmutation involves a kind of strategic, one could say maybe intervention even into Eckart, rather than just a faithful interpretation of his thought. So maybe it would be, one could even say it is maybe even an attempt then to maybe use this Nietzschean scheme or this Nietzschean interpretation of Zarathustra and the encounter with the saint of allowing a different approach to Eckart, of leading maybe Eckart as a more saintly figure, pushing him towards this direction that Nishitani rather sees in the anti-Christian, fully realizing this anti-Christian vision of Zarathustra at that time. Okay, yes, that's really. Thank you very much for your comment.
Yeah, thank you for your reply. That was extremely helpful.
Can I just ask? Can I just ask?
Yeah, very briefly.
You know, I think you mentioned von der nächsten Liebe, right? Where he says, "I preach to you not the love of the nearest, but the love of the farthest." Well, in English, we have the great novel by T.H. Lawrence, Women in Love, where, for example, the hero says to the heroine, anyway, I can't find it now, but he says, "I want to love like two stars in conjunction, two distant stars." And he uses this language, which, of course, is completely unwelcome to the heroine. And he uses the same stars for his friend who dies at the end of the book. So this is a very human interpretation of Nietzsche. The kind of love we should practice. It's a little bit like it also has later. Do you think that this kind of very human and very almost romantic interpretation of Nietzsche's Fernstenliebe is relevant?
To reply quickly, as I also offered as a kind of suggestion for how to read also the Nishitanian take on this Fernstenliebe. I would say it is helpful as a contrast to what Nishitani attempts, in the sense that I think I would think that this, as also suggested, Fernstenliebe in this case is an attempt to transform the neighbor into the farthest, or the Nächsten in den Fernsten. Or sorry, yeah, Fernste becomes the farthest, becomes almost the definition of the closest, paradoxically speaking. Why? Because I see what we talked about earlier, this logic of alienation, of always already being outside oneself and always already being disfigured or deformed or extimate to oneself, to use a Lacanian term, by being exposed to the void or exposed to the emptiness, from which paradoxically one first finds oneself or receives oneself in this reflective logic, to be just another expression for what is this farthest and nearest, closest and nearest relation. So it is not the romantic aspiration to something that is far removed from me, but on the contrary, it is the recognition of that which makes the one who is closest to me close precisely insofar as he shares the same constitutive lack and emptiness from which everyone receives his being. So I would say that this would be my take on it, that it is not about a relation of distance or of setting afar the farthest from the closest and kind of skipping over ahead that which is close towards that which is far, to look far beyond to the horizon, but rather recognizing this primordial distance that separates everyone from oneself always already in one's so-called neighbor. So I would rather take this as a contrast in reading and offer a Nishitanian version of love of the farthest as an interpretation of love of one's neighbor, who always already is outside of himself, in distance to himself, farthest to himself, and therefore close.
Well, Lawrence might agree with that, in fact. Yeah.
Well, okay, I have to, yes, read them again and deepen. Thank you.